A few years ago, actually not a few years ago, but 15 or 20 years ago, the French and Indian War was rediscovered and presented to American readers as a really important event that you should be aware of. Um, and it was really important because Americans are told still, that the French and Indian War is really important because it was the war that made America, to to quote a famous title on it. It was the war that produced the American Revolution. That's what it's important, why it's important. But historians were less clear on why. Why did a highly successful war lead to the breakout of the breakup of the British Empire? Okay. Why would a war that the British Empire won so handily lead to the empire's disintegration? Now the timeline is clear. The war ended, and then the problems between American settlers and their British government sprang up. Okay. But the cause and effect remains vague. Okay, so we can see how the war ended, the revolutionary struggle or crisis began, but historians have been less clear on what's the connection. Is it simply um, um, the 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 timeliness of the two events, or is there an actual cause and effect relationship between the war and what happened after? Now, the reason historians remain vague on this on cause and effect is that there are different possible storylines that could explain how exactly the French and Indian War produced the American Revolution. A former colleague of mine, named of Mike Campbell, also an American historian, he described the relationship between Parliament and the American assemblies as a long-standing marital relationship, in which in the long marriage, many things go unspoken, which allow the relationship to persist and flourish smoothly. Okay. You know, he related this by discussing his own marriage, and he said, "Look, I know that I'm the leader of my household, and I'm the final authority when it comes to important family decisions. And I'm sure that my wife is as convinced that she is the leader, and that what she says goes. And thank goodness we've been living like this side by side for almost 50 years. Okay. Now, he says, now imagine what would happen if I came home one day and sat her down and told her, now, Diana, we're going to talk this out and settle exactly who holds ultimate authority in this household when it comes to, major purchases or plans for retirement, or what decisions on family affairs and things like that. What do you think would happen to my nice marriage? Okay. So according to my colleague, this is exactly what happened in the British Empire during the long colonial, during the period that we call the period of salutary neglect. Okay, so during the late 17th and 18th century, when things were going so smoothly, and the imperial government had established this kind of very good working relationship with provincial assemblies. So again, so during this long period, they did not talk about political theory, about who holds ultimate authority in this relationship, in this empire. And then in 1763, right after the French and Indian War, Parliament started an earnest conversation about who exactly is in charge of what in this relationship. And pretty soon, both sides lawyered up, and things went downhill from there. So the question is, why this happened suddenly in 1763. What prompted this destructive, honest debate about the system of government in this empire? It could have been money problems. Okay? Just like financial woes might prompt spouses to sit down and argue over who decides on how to raise and spend the family's money, the debate between Parliament and the assemblies might have been a product of the huge national debt that Britain had incurred during the French and Indian War. Okay, so that's one option. It could have been accusations of disloyalty. Just like infidelity might prompt spouses to argue over their respective responsibilities to one another within a marriage contract, the debate about the empire's governing structure might have been the product of accusations of widespread breaches of trust on the colonists' part during the war. That as British forces were fighting in the field, English settlers were engaged in smuggling, trading with the enemy, profiteering, obstruction of imperial military plans, etc. Okay, so since you betrayed my trust, now we're going to discuss the foundations of this relationship. It could be that one partner was, as we say in therapeutic language, that one spouse was evolving within the relationship. Okay? In the century that followed the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament was gradually kind of growing into itself, feeling its growing power within the British or English political system, and taking the reins of authority firmly in hand in its relationship with the king. Okay, so over the century from the 1780s on up to the leading to the American Revolution, Parliament was feeling its oats. Parliamentarians steadily entrenched the notion that everywhere that the king held power, he was checked by Parliament, or he shared his authority with Parliament. Okay, so Parliament was establishing a greater presence and greater confidence within the British political structure. And this doctrine that was evolving within Parliament, the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, it encouraged centralized managerial control, not only in Britain, but also in the empire. Okay? And especially during the French and Indian War, during and after the French and Indian War. Okay? This kind of parliamentary absolutism was very much in line with European royal absolutism. Okay? This kind of centralization or centralized supervision and managerial care that Parliament was establishing was in line with governing structures in Europe. But it clashed with the traditional English habit of local governance, of local populations governing themselves. Okay? And because of this new parliamentary mindset triggered a traditionalist and localist resistance movement in England and in Scotland, in the Jacobite rebellions, and also in time in the colonies. And not even in the Jacobite rebellions per se, but in the Jacobite movement, which was not simply a Scottish movement. It was a widespread movement in England as well. Okay, so this parliamentary supremacy or parliamentary centralization, parliamentary absolutism triggered resistance everywhere that British people lived, in England, in Scotland, and in America. So So again, so this is the kind of the evolution of one partner in the relationship affects the other partner and causes a reaction. Um, Another theory is that it could simply have been cohabitation itself. Okay, the presence of these two partners together in close proximity creates unwelcomed consequences because the the war's North American campaigns, the the French and Indian War is just the American theater of a much broader war, what's called the Seven Years' War. But the point, our focus here is in North America in this relationship, and the British campaigns in North America brought colonists and British authorities into close and constant contact with one another. Because not only did imperial authorities have to work more closely than ever before with provincial assemblies to sustain the war effort, but the war also placed the British Royal Navy in a position to act as a law enforcement agency in American waters, in American ports, dealing with issues like trading with the enemy, smuggling, etc., piracy. Additionally, tens of thousands of British redcoats served alongside provincial troops during this long war, and then after they lived among provincial civilians for roughly a decade between the end of the French and Indian War and the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So perhaps this close interaction in such close quarters made both sides more prickly about their privacy and their autonomy, prompting a debate about who's in charge of what in the provinces. Okay, just kind of like if you think of a very long road trip might lead to spouses. When you live in a house, there's more um, the contact is less intense than in a closed car for hours. Okay? So a long car ride can prompt deep discussions about the nature of a relationship and with kind of unpleasant overtones. And perhaps the war was that kind of uncomfortable environment. Um, Another possible explanation, again, historians are not clear about how the war produced the revolution, okay? Because it could be so many different things. Um, so another explanation is that the global conquests of the war brought other parties into what had previously been a simple and intimate relationship between Britain and its North American colonies or North American colonists. Because before the war, the British Empire was a settler empire, meaning it was made up of colonies in which British settlers governed themselves. Okay, so these were British settlers who left England or left Britain, settled and reproduced. And so they were British, and they carried with them British sensibilities, including the ones about local self-government. Um, and this decentralization, this decentralized empire was, again, decentralized in the sense that it wasn't governed from the center, but the empire was the empire comprised different colonies in which the local British population governed itself. And this decentralization was viable and sustainable because the colonies were populated by loyal and patriotic British people, British settlers. However, the recent war, the French and Indian War, brought all sorts of various conquered peoples under British rule, not just in the American West and in the Ohio Valley, but also in Spanish Florida, in French Canada, and also in India and in West Africa. Okay. So all of a sudden, the the imperial government found itself governing or supervising or in control of not just loyal and patriotic British settlers, but also former enemies who were not British and had no reason to be uh, British patriots or loyal Britons. So in this new context, a decentralized empire of self-governing provinces made no sense at all because these newly acquired possessions, populated as they were by disloyal populations, conquered populations, um, if the old governing system of self-governing provinces were applied to these new territories, then Britain would lose these new territories immediately. Okay? Because if these former enemies were allowed to govern themselves, then they would govern themselves into independence. They had no sentiment, no loyalty, no patriotism towards Britain. So from their central position, when you think of this new situation from the perspective of British authorities in London, you can see how from their central position, imperial authorities include, from the king to parliament to the bureaucracy beneath them, imperial authorities had to devise a new way to govern these newly conquered territories and newly governed peoples. But this reconceptualization and reorganization of the British Empire took place throughout the empire rather than just in these new non-Anglo components. And the only alternative to this would have been to have essentially two British empires, a decentralized empire for settler colonies like Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, Jamaica, Barbados, and a separate centrally governed empire for conquered possessions like Florida, Quebec, Bengal, etc. Okay. And because this would have been bureaucratically and intellectually schizophrenic, Britain quickly shifted from the decentralized model of a settler empire in which local populations govern themselves to um, a different model of a conquered empire that is governed from the center. Now, as one would expect, the settler colonies bristled and resisted this abrupt shift, prompting that frank and open discussion between Britain and its American settlers about the nature of their relationship. What kind of relationship was this? How is this house structured? And who wielded authority within it? So these different explanations, these different cause and effect narratives linking the French and Indian War on the one hand and the Revolution on the other hand, they cannot all go together. You can't say, oh yes, all of the above. Okay, one cannot simply kind of point out to, oh, shades of gray, it's not black and white, and throw all of these explanations out there as the cause for the revolution. So historians are therefore forced to choose one explanation and discard the others, which they are, excuse me, they are reluctant to do without clear and decisive evidence, which is not there. There's evidence for this, evidence for that, And and the result is that historians are unable um, to draw a clear cause and effect narrative explaining the how exactly the French and Indian War produced the American Revolution. Thank you.